So I'm going to tell you about a story of my son, Jonathan. It's called The Boy Who Blessed the Rabbi. In the middle of a pouring rainstorm, we left to meet the rabbi. Jonathan was too weak to wait for a taxi, especially in the treacherous weather, so my mother drove in from New Jersey to help us navigate to the appointment. She pulled up directly in front of our apartment building. As I climbed into the back seat and Jacob helped Jonathan ease in beside me, it reminded me of the many times my parents had sped off to the doctor's offices or hospitals when Gary was having trouble breathing. I was the one who had to keep it together for the sake of my child. The rain was pounding down sideways, and people's umbrellas were blown inside out as they pushed through the storm. "Grandma's taxi at your service," my mother said, beaming at our sick boy, trying to lighten the mood. Jonathan smiled softly. It had taken a lot of energy for him to leave the apartment. We drove up to a tree-lined street and exited the car in front of a beautiful brownstone. The steep flight of broad steps took a long time for Jonathan to navigate. I held him up by supporting him under his armpits, while Jacob held the umbrella over us so we would not get completely drenched. We then entered a long corridor filled with dozens of people waiting for a private audience with the rabbi. I helped Jonathan sit down in the one empty seat. A tall gentleman with an elaborate mustache stood up and motioned for me to take his chair so that I could sit next to my son. "That's very kind of you," I said in a whisper. He smiled and looked compassionately at my son as he said, "It's my pleasure." Jonathan leaned into me and closed his eyes. Scanning the length of the corridor, I noticed that he was the only child in the room. When people saw Jonathan lying across my lap, they nodded their heads, and I felt their empathy and tenderness. Everyone appeared deflated and sad. All around us, people whispered in hushed tones, saying prayers and imploring God for a miracle to happen to themselves or their loved ones. When our turn came, a man in a large black hat with a twinkle in his eye and a kind face opened the door and motioned for us to come inside. Here, the rabbi sat behind a large table with a sweet, radiant smile. The rabbi motioned for Jonathan to come closer. John stood up and walked around the table next to the rabbi. The rabbi placed both of his hands on top of Jonathan's head and started rocking gently back and forth as he recited a blessing with his eyes closed. After the rabbi finished giving Jonathan a Hebrew blessing, he handed John a piece of paper with a written blessing. Jonathan gave me a knowing look. The night before, when I was tucking him in to say goodnight, John had asked me what to expect and what it would be like to meet the rabbi. I had answered that hundreds of people come from all around the world to meet with this rabbi to get a blessing. My sweet boy replied, "Who blesses the rabbi?" I told him that God blesses the rabbi. Jonathan felt that it wasn't right for the rabbi to bless him without being able to give this rabbi a blessing in return. I knew that's what Jonathan wanted to do. The rabbi looked at the three of us and asked, "Is there anything else you'd like to share?" "Yes, Rabbi," I said, "there's one more thing. Jonathan would like to give you a blessing." The rabbi's eyes opened a little wider, and his entire countenance glowed as he gently motioned for Jonathan to come closer. Jonathan stood up slowly and placed his hands right in the middle of the rabbi's hat as both of them lowered their heads and closed their eyes. When Jonathan finished his blessing, the rabbi embraced him. Later that night, I asked Jonathan if he felt good about the visit. He nodded his head and said earnestly, "It makes me feel good to have a blessing and to know that people care about me." I stroked his blonde curls and told him how much I loved him. "What did you say in your blessing to the rabbi, Jonathan?" Jonathan looked up with his big blue eyes and said, "I'm sorry, Mommy. I can't tell you my blessing. It's between me and God." I kissed him tenderly on the forehead, and he went to sleep. That night, I contemplated how moving it was to witness Jonathan's beautiful soul and generous nature. His desire to bless the rabbi illustrated the power that small acts of kindness can have to create a sense of agency, meaning, and purpose, even when someone is seriously ill.